Based on the dates, which are all from March of 1996, we have Norm Nathan shows from the 3rd, 4th, and 16th of that year. It's a regular Guest-a-Palooza. Hey, let's make that the title. The first guest, author Vicki León, who wrote Uppity Women of Ancient Times, and she shares some fascinating stories of more than 200 women throughout 3,200 years of history. Guest number 2, author Liza Copeland, who had written Just Cruising, and now is talking about her sequel to that book, Still Cruising. She tells tales of sailing the world for 6 years with her family. Guest number 3. Well, not really. J. Ben Lesser, author of A Foxy Old Woman's Guide to Traveling Alone Around Town and Around the World. After Norm's intro, the interview flew away into the ether. So, next guest, David Feldman, author of What Are Hyenas Laughing At Anyway? He's a certified expert on imponderables. We actually take calls with David. We hear from David in Newton, Andrea in Canton, and Jean in Medford. And to close out the show, it's all calls for Norm. Steve, who was a relative of Are Hyenas, Greta talking chickens and the first egg of spring, and Kathy, who wants more Norm but can't pick up WBZ in Connecticut. Episode 225, Guest-a-Palooza, invites its way to your ears now.
He's my kind of man. I listen to Norm Nathan every time I can on WBZ in Boston, the Norm Nathan Show.
This is the Norm Nathan Show, and just so darn exciting to be with you. It's about 6 after 11. It is a cold night. I can vouch for that. I give you a first-hand eyewitness account, having been outside. But it's the temperature's 20 degrees, as Bob Ames had just said, but the wind is really whipping up, and it just feels like we've lapsed back into wintertime again. But chin up. Let's see, how does the saying go? Spring is really on the way. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to talk with Vicki León in just a few minutes. She's written a number of books, the latest of which is called Uppity Women of Ancient Times. It's a fascinating book about women who lived way, way back. León, I'm glad to talk with you, Vicki León.
Nice to talk with you, too.
Okay, and Vicki is the author of a book called Uppity Women. I love that title, Uppity Women. Nobody likes an uppity woman. Guys don't, because they feel it cuts into their masculinity. I have a feeling we're seeing that reflected in a lot of the first ladies, for example, have taken heat. Not just Mrs. Clinton, but it goes back to probably everybody. Because I remember Eleanor Roosevelt, who took a lot of heat because she seemed like a very independent woman who people thought were uppity and that kind of stuff. Is that the kind of thing that you had in mind?
Well, absolutely. In fact, both in our times and in ancient times, women have had a lot of barriers to overcome, as you know. And way back when, just like in our century, it took a very motivated, occasionally ruthless woman to overcome those barriers, and women often got bad-mouthed in the process. Maybe we should define our term uppity, though. I think your audience might get a kick out of it. In my research, I ran across a story about a very picky male shopper back in old Sparta. Remember Sparta, the Greek city-state?
Yes.
Well, this story is 2,500 years old or so. But anyway, this fellow was out comparison shopping for a slave or two, and he was out checking out every single female on display at the market that day. And he finally went up to one particular woman, and I don't know, the guy must have been looking for a slave with a money-back guarantee, because he said, "Now, if I buy you, will you promise to be good?" And she stared back at him. She was very cool, and, it's kind of tough to be cool when you're standing on an auction block in your birthday suit, but she did it. She looked him right in the eye, and she said, "Well, yeah, I'll be good if you buy me, but hey, I'll be just as good if you don't." And to me, she epitomizes the uppity woman, whether past or present, full of, spunk and humor. and that certain sense of self-worth, no matter what hand life has dealt you. And she had some pretty crappy cards.
I love the way you phrased that. Anyway, I know just before we get into that, the uppity women of ancient times. I was just looking at your background, and you used to write on nature, and maybe you still do, on nature and travel and all that
Yes,
kind
indeed.
of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And you write for a company, the Canary Press, that has this. Did this spawn a group called the Wild Woman Association?
Oh, well, actually, the Wild Women Association began with a book that was done about 3 years ago. I did not do this book. It was by Autumn Stevens, and it was called Wild Women, and it was about women in Victorian times. And consequently, the response was so great to that book that the organization, they started this organization, and it has quite a few thousand members, card-carrying wild women, who are also being invited to participate as they read the Uppity Women book. So this is one of a series of books about women in times other than our own, although maybe we'll be doing some in the present day too. But basically it's a way of writing women back into history because they have been written out of it or overlooked out of history for so long.
As I looked through your book, Vicki, I was impressed with the fact that a lot of women in the times we're talking about, and we're talking about between 2800 BC, 458. I mean, really a long time ago.
Right, 3,200 years of history. Yeah.
A lot of these women accomplished quite a good deal and were in very strong positions of authority.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think women during that period were more independent and than they are today? Because we've been going through this feminist kind of thing. And as I look through your book, I many of them led the armies and did all kinds of things that I wonder whether they would be allowed to do today even.
Well, you do have a good point there. There certainly were women who had, when they had power, when they grabbed it, they certainly knew what to do with it, and in many ways, perhaps exercised more raw power than, like you say, commensurate woman would today. But nevertheless, I still think that, by and large, we have it. We have it a great deal easier than they did. They 2,000 years ago, a woman could create a huge stink simply by being successful at almost anything. And so, consequently, the women who did make it to the top were, really had tremendous will. One of the things I'd like to mention here, Norm, is that people tend to think of, if they think of women in ancient times at all, they think, well, Cleopatra, maybe a queen or two, right? But one of the things that I took special joy in was encountering and digging out some of these women who were not royals and who weren't, born with a silver spoon in their mouth, like Kubaba. Did you notice her? Did you remember her?
I read about so many. Refresh my memory.
Okay.
On her.
Well, she's one of my very favorite blue-collar success stories. She was a woman who used beer to get to the top in old Mesopotamia. And what better way, right? She was a tavern owner in the city of Kish, which, 4,500 years ago, long time ago in ancient Mesopotamia. But she obviously had more ambitions than, running an early version of Cheers. But ultimately, she became the ruler of this city, and she may very well have controlled other parts of the land of Mesopotamia as well. And she started a dynasty, and that continued with her offspring for 100 years. This gal was the big enchilada of the whole area, but she was obviously very down to earth because on the king's lists, which have survived to our day, on those clay tablets that you read about, she simply called herself Kubaba the Beer Woman. I don't know. I think that's classy myself.
I think that's very classy also.
Talk about roots, huh?
Now, how did you dig up the story of so many women that you talk about, from thousands of years ago. You mentioned at one point that this is before paper and stuff, and a lot of histories and things were on tablets. And that kind of stuff. Obviously, they've been reprinted in other ways other than tablets and all that. But how did you dig up? Because you're talking many women. Some of them very, very obscure. How do you go about researching a book like this?
Well, you know, Norm, it is true that clues to these women turned up in some of the darndest places, and sometimes the clues I followed didn't even feel like clues at first. You know, it was kind of an intuitive detective search. For example, I'll just tell you a little story about how I came across one woman. I was living in Spain years ago, and I was learning to cook, and I went to buy a double boiler. Do you know what that is?
Yes, I do.
Well, good for you. I'm not every person knows that, but anyway.
Are you being condescending?
No,
I'm a guy.
No, I'm not. But anyway, I just phrased that very carefully. I did. Anyway, but the thing is, getting back to this double boiler, it took me forever to find one in Spain, and it wasn't too surprising because they called it a baño Maria, which means a Mary's bath, and nobody could tell me why it had this odd name. And later on, I was in France and Italy for a while, and it was the same story there. Well, so that didn't even seem like a clue to anything. It was just a very odd thing, and I kept it kind of in my mental file of weird facts. And years later, I found a couple of sentences about a female alchemist whose name was Mary. I thought, well, there's a coincidence for you. Then, a little while after that, I located a diagram which showed one of Mary's inventions, and there it was. It was the prototype of the double boiler. And so finally, this Mary's Bath name made sense. And it only took me about 20 years, but then I had enough threads to tell her story.
How did you just kind of backtracking just a little bit, how did you happen to switch from the other stuff that you wrote, the nature and travel and that, and onto this? And what about nature and travel? What kind of books obviously, what kind of books? You wrote about nature and travel. That's a silly question. But where did you write this? And how did you get into that? And how did you swing over to what you did in this Uppity Women book?
Well, you know, really, Norm, the whole women thing almost predates all my other activities, because some 25 or 30 years ago, I was doing a lot of traveling. I was living in Spain and Greece and Israel, and my travels took me to Greece and to the island of Crete, where I stayed for a while. And, you know, that's the home of the Minoan civilization, which was, flourished some 4,000 years ago. And that experience, it just knocked me out. I don't quite know how to describe it. I was so drawn to it, and especially when I saw that women had clearly played some important roles in that society. In fact, you might notice on the cover of the Uppity Women book, those are Minoan ladies. Those are Minoan ladies, and you have probably seen those illustrations elsewhere because they're very famous. Well, being on Crete and encountering this incredible ancient civilization with such vitality and such opportunities for women just kind of jump-started my search. And so consequently, kind of mole-like, I have been collecting this material and wading through countless libraries, and I've done a lot of on-site research in various Mediterranean countries for, like I say, a quarter of a century. Meanwhile, again, I was, doing lots of other things, other types of books. Obviously, travel was one of my first loves, and I've done a number of travel guides. It was an easier sell than Ancient Women, let me tell you. But the nature thing came about because that's another thing I'm very interested in. But some years ago, in San Luis Obispo, where I live, which is in central California on the coast, a local graphics communication company wanted to start a publishing arm, and asked me to help out. And so, consequently, I got the wonderful opportunity of building a line of books from the ground up. And we ended up publishing 22 different nature titles and 7 or 8 different travel titles. So that's kind of how I began in writing in general, and specifically how I got involved with the women. And the thing is that all along I've been collecting material, and I did an earlier book on the Greek women philosophers, but it wasn't until I kind of had this amount of material and I had finally gotten a good, I had gotten a take on the material, figured out just how to work with it, that then everything kind of clicked, where I found the perfect publisher, which is Canary Press, and they really are an outstanding company here in California.
Okay, that's where you are right this minute.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you're kind of lucky, because it's lucky for you not to be where we are here in New England.
It sounds a little chilly tonight.
It is very cold, and the wind is really whipping up, and we have snow on the ground, and the roads are icy.
Ooh.
And you don't care about that at all, because where are you, in the Los Angeles area?
Well, no, we're equidistant between Los Angeles and San Francisco, in a beautiful coastal region called San Luis Obispo County.
Oh, yes, I know that area.
Do you?
I mean, I don't know it well. I've traveled down through there at one time. I think that's beautiful country.
It is. It's very pretty.
Yeah. Okay, now, I don't know where to begin, because you mentioned so many women, most of whom have names I can't even pronounce.
They're tough, aren't they?
Yeah, they're kind of tough, but they're fascinating. It's fascinating stuff. And the way you write about them, I think, is particularly fascinating. I was looking for a typical example of how you write, because you write in a very earthy kind of way. It's not written in this. I mean, it's scholarly, but it's not the pedantic kind of thing you expect to read.
I did try to write in street language, and in a way that, because I'm not a scholar, and I want to write something that people just like me will enjoy, and that you don't need an advanced degree or a tremendous specialized background to understand, because really these are civilizations that are very far removed from us in place and time. So I'm glad to hear that you think I've been successful.
No, you very much have been successful at that, so far as I'm concerned. I know, because I think you write well, and you write with kind of tongue-in-cheek and fun, and you get your point across. And I certainly would argue with you when you say you're not scholarly, because I don't think that's true at all. There's no way you could have done the kinds of things you do without being extremely scholarly.
Yeah, well, scholarly in the sense that, yes, I mean, I've conducted a long and careful research, but it's not written in scholarly fashion. That would be I guess what we would want to tell people, right?
Right. Here's my easy way out, and that is to ask you to pick on some of the women that you found particularly intriguing.
Okay.
And if you would just tell us about them, because I've enjoyed the book a very great deal. And I just don't know where to begin to ask you stuff. So anyway, tell us.
Okay, well, let me start out with someone who was kind of a fighter and a lover. Her name was Artemisia II. And Artie, too, she really did it all. She was, besides keeping her kingdom in ancient Asia Minor in line, she built the seventh wonder of the ancient world. And it was in honor of her late husband. His name was Mausolus, and so Artie built the world's first mausoleum. Well, that's where we get the name. And this, the mausoleum that Artie built, though, it was really a traffic stopper. The thing was 14 stories high. It was as big around at the base as a football field, and it had a 24-step pyramid in the middle. Must have been a peculiar-looking thing. But the thing about Artie, she carried the grieving widow thing kind of to extremes. It seems her husband had died 3 years prior, and that's why she built this monument to him. But anyway, she invented a special wine cooler to drink at happy hour every day at the mausoleum. And Norm, do you want to guess what the secret ingredient of that wine cooler was?
I've just been looking at your book to see if I remembered. Now, what was it was made with her husband's bones and ashes?
That's right. A generous amount of old hubby's bones and ashes, and she threw in a few spices to kind of cut the taste, too. Yeah. But needless to say, that it was probably clogged arteries and not a broken heart that sent Artie on her way to a side-by-side with Mausolus about 3 years after he died. So that was the story of Artie. But let me tell you about go to Egypt, and one of the things that also kind of turned into a pattern as I was writing this book was that looking at women through these from the female perspective, we also learn a lot about men of long ago. And for example, how about King Tut? Everybody's heard about King Tut and his tomb. Well, the truth is that Tut didn't do squat. He lived to be 18 years old, and he did almost nothing. His wife, Guest-a-Palooza.
I love the way you. And you're right. You're right the way you're talking, which I think is lovely.
Yeah. Well,
anyway.
I was going to say you're getting a sense of how the book is written, because it certainly is. It doesn't mince any words. Guest-a-Palooza was Tut's wife, and she led a most amazing life. You remember the Pharaoh's little habit of marital incest?
I remember reading about it in your book, yes.
They were very very prone to that. Well, as a teen, Ank's first job was to marry her daddy, and then he died. Then she married her uncle. He didn't last. And finally, she married her 9-year-old brother, Tut. Well, Ankh was more than just a pretty piece of wedding cake to be handed around in a passive way. When Tut died after 10 years, this 3-time widow, she suspected there was yet another relative lurking in the wings, and she was a gutsy kid. She sent a quick kind of a FedEx message to the neighboring Hittite king, and she asked him to send one of his sons to her, pronto, because she only had 70 days. That's how long it took to embalm, a king those days. And anyway, she sent this Hittite king a message and said, "Look, I'll make one of your sons the Pharaoh of Egypt." Well, the king finally came through, and unfortunately, the bridegroom-to-be was intercepted and rubbed out. And on Guest-a-Palooza, who was 22 years old, now she was without a game plan. She was now forced into marriage number 4 with none other than her own creepy and murderous grandfather. I mean, that's a pretty full life, I might say.
I guess so. I love the way you tell this story. Do you think uppity women of ancient times, your book, Vicki, will one day be required reading in Sunday school classes? Because you're talking about the kind of the era that kids are taught to something, not quite this way, though.
Well, it's a nice thing that you brought that up, because the other day I gave a talk at the local university here, and you know who attended? There were 4 classes of 6th graders who were brought there by their teachers because they had been studying ancient history and Mesopotamia and Egypt. And you know what they asked their teacher? They said, "Where are the women?" And the teacher happened to have gotten a copy of my book for Christmas, and then they learned of this speech I was giving, so they brought all 4 of their classes, girls and boys, and I thought that was one of the most wonderful things that's come out of this.
No, I think it's great, and again, the earthy language that you use in the street. How did you phrase that? The street language and all that kind of stuff.
It's bratty, isn't it?
Well, it puts it in perspective. I mean, I think it makes people human, even though they lived 3,000-4,000 years ago. And most books that you read, these people don't seem real. They never seem real. And in your book, they do. And that's one of the reasons I liked it. And you have sketches on so many of these uppity women, written that way and brief and all of that. It's just a great deal of fun to read it. Uppity women of ancient times, and I think it puts a whole lot of things in perspective. One more question before I let you go, Vicki.
Sure. Proud enough of her accomplishments to talk about them on her tombstone, and so that's how we learn that she was lawyers and so on. For example, there was one of the earliest women in my book was named Merit Ta, and she was a doctor in Egypt 4,700 years ago, before the pyramids were even built. Isn't that amazing? And we know of her because her son was proud enough of her accomplishments to talk about them on her tombstone, and so that's how we learn that she was she was an accomplished doctor.
Have women made any progress over these 4,000 years or so, do you think?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, we are the beneficiaries of these earlier women's struggle, and granted, it had to kept the these struggles have had to been these battles have had to be fought again and again. That time, as you go through different ages, sometimes there are backward steps, and before you go forward, it isn't just a continuum. But we definitely have benefited so much by the boat rocking that these early women did, whether they were queens or slaves or politicians or pirates. These gals were survivors, and they were early role models for us.
How do you think you would have fared in those times? Do you think you would have led an army, or your opportunities would have been greater or different? This is a really stupid question. I'm saying, is this really coming out of my mouth? These stupid comments. I guess the reason I was asking is I was married for a very long time to a very strong woman, and she would have been considered an uppity woman. My mother, to a lesser extent, would have been considered that too. So I tell you that, well, come close. I don't want everybody to hear this, but I have this thing for uppity women. I think,
all right.
No, I think they're interesting. I think they're just not the usual bland kind of, June Cleaver kind of people, or Harriet Nelson and the Nelson family and stuff. I cannot imagine anybody living with people that bland. So when I read your book about these women who've again, led battles and done all these wild kinds of things, even those who have put the husband's bones into something that they've drunk and all that kind of stuff. I find them so intriguing, and that's why I find the whole book absolutely intriguing. I would have loved to have known some of these women.
Great.
I would have loved to have sat down and talked with so many of them.
I would too, and I must say I would have liked very much to have lived back then. I'm very drawn to that period. I don't know whether I would have survived or not, but I probably would have mouthed off the way that any number of these uppity women did.
I would guess, too, that they had to do this kind of quickly because their lifespan was not too terribly long back then.
That's right. Most people had much shorter lifespans than both men and women.
Just tell the story of Esther. I mention that because we're coming into Purim on the Jewish calendar, and the story you had about Esther sort of ties in with that.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that's one that people do know from the Bible, don't you think? I mean, that's one that's more familiar than most. The unsung heroine of that story, although I really love Esther, was her predecessor, Vashti. Vashti was married to, she was a blue-blooded Persian, and she was married to a Persian king who obviously, ran everything and was considered, the absolute last word on earth. And anyway, he was throwing an intimate little party for 10,000 people or so. And anyway, they had all been drinking for about a week, and he thought it'd be a great idea to have his gorgeous wife come out, and he'd show her off. And he summoned her, and she just said, "Well, no way, I'm not going to go out there," because she had a feeling he wanted to display all her charms, and maybe he did. This was this party.
You're talking about her taking off her clothes and that kind of displaying all her charms?
It wasn't clear. It's not clear just what he wanted her to display, but obviously she thought that whatever it was definitely out of line. So she said no, and consequently they got into a real stalemate about it, and his counselors huddled and said, "Well, you just can't have a woman telling you what to do like that," and so he ended up banishing her. And then he started, kind of a star search for another wife, and that's how Esther came to the picture. And she and her uncle were Jews who had been living in exile in Persia, of course, for many generations by this time. So they were probably in many ways Persian as well as being Jewish. And so she kind of auditioned for the king, and he took a look at a lot of women, and he obviously liked what he saw, and she was in. And Anyway, there's a complex story about Uncle Morty and how he and the another fellow named Haman, are doing power struggles kind of behind the king's back and so on. But ultimately, Esther triumphed and managed to save the whole Jewish population from being annihilated by the fiendish backstage work of this Haman, and consequently, that she did end up being very much of a heroine for the Jewish population of Susa, which was this capital city of Persia. So that's the story of Esther, kind of taken out of its religious context. But of course, that's why Purim is celebrated, is to celebrate the fact that she saved the Jewish population, and consequently it was every year that there are all the different things having to do with Haman and so on, and those traditions are preserved today.
I think you're adorable, and that's condescending. It sounds condescending. I don't mean it in that way.
No, I take it in the best possible way. I am adorable, Norm. Yeah, and I just appreciate your consummate good taste and ability to sense that over the phone.
Well, there is a picture of you in the book also, which would indicate that very, very strongly.
Oh, well, you think that's me? That's actually Esther.
Oh, that's really Esther who sat in for you. I do the same thing. I have people like Robert Redford sit in for me taking pictures.
I think it's so wise. Actually, I look more like June Cleaver, but don't tell anybody.
Oh, stop. Okay. Anyway, is the book available? Most Canary Press. I'm spelling it sounding it like the bird, but it's Conari.
It's pronounced Canary Press, and it should be available all over Boston and the Eastern Seaboard in good bookstores. Both independents and chains should be in all of those. And if someone should have difficulty, they can call Canari's 800 number.
And that is?
Which is 800-685-9595.
Okay, 1-800-685-9595.
Right.
No, it's just kind of fun. I have a feeling I've failed terribly on this interview because I didn't mention a whole lot of the things that you mention in the book, which is really interesting. But you talk about an awful lot of people, a lot of the women.
Nearly 200 women, exactly. Yeah.
And many of them, and they're all absolutely fascinating, and it's a great way not only of learning about what women were doing back in those very, very early days, but also it puts a great perspective on places like Mesopotamia, all kinds of places that sounded exotic to us and kind of mysterious and maybe almost forbidden. Like too much. What do I care about Mesopotamia? But you put it in some great perspective and early Egypt and all of that. And it's just fun to read, and you've got some great illustrations and all in there too. Uppity women of ancient times. Oops, Vicki.
Yeah.
That's your very book. Here's what it sounds like when it's bounced on the table in Boston all the way across the United States. Anyway, by Vicki León, who's the person who we've been talking with, and I really appreciate you coming on the air with us at this time. And Liza Copeland, who's written a sequel to the book Just Cruising, and called Still Cruising. She and her husband and 3 sons traveled around the world and were on the sea for 6 years. Well, you were not constantly on the sea for 6 years, but the trip took 6 years. And what a fascinating trip that was. Does life seem kind of dull for you now, Liza?
Oh, yes. In fact, Norm, I have to tell you, we're planning another trip.
Oh, really?
That's right. We hope next year to do the canals and rivers of Europe and go through probably up the Seine to Paris and then link in with the canals to the Rhine. That now there's a canal joins it to the Danube, and then we'll finish in the Black Sea.
Son of a gun. I knew we couldn't keep you on land very long.
We just keep my husband happy, you understand? Now,
your husband was in the Royal Navy, and you had done a lot of sailing and all that before then. So you were not a couple of inexperienced people. Life on the waters was not something that you had not known about.
No, that's right. We actually, Andy and I met in Venezuela in a world championship in small boats and sunfish, but we had done quite a lot of sailing before, and we did quite a lot together and raced a lot before we ventured out on our trip. But I would like to add that most people out there had not got the experience we had, and the important thing then is to be comfortable with your boat. Certainly take as many courses as you can, find out as much as you can as possible, and just ease into the lifestyle gradually. You know, don't set off on a long ocean trip as your first trip, and certainly don't go down into an area that's a hurricane area at the wrong time.
Because you went into some interesting areas. Somewhere there were, you know, there were pirates and all of that kind of thing, and very odd weather conditions. Well, I guess when you're on the sea for 6 years, you're bound to run in just about every possible condition you can. Tell me about the Bagheera, which was the name of your boat, Bagheera. Where did the name come from? What was the boat like?
Okay, the boat is a Beneteau. Beneteau is a French company, and they also have a plant in the States, a 38-footer. The name Bagheera comes from the Black Panther in the Rudyard Kipling Jungle Book, the Mowgli stories, and we'd had the name for quite a few years for many boats, and for us it was symbolic. Bagheera was sleek and fast, and so have our boats been. So we had chosen this boat. We'd looked at a lot of boats, but for us it worked very well. It had 3 cabins where we could sleep, so the 2 aft ones, the boys went in, and we put an upper bunk for the 3rd child. And then we slept forward, and we had a big main cabin area where they did school, a good chart table, and, of course, quite a few instruments, and a reasonable galley with a big refrigerator and subsequently a freezer. So actually we were very comfortable on board. We never had what people envision, which is cabin fever.
Yeah, because, you know, when you think of somebody taking a trip like you did, say across the Indian Ocean as part of the trip, which is massive, you would think that a family of 5 people just cooped up together, or maybe you didn't feel like you were, obviously you didn't feel like you were cooped up together. You would think you'd get on each other's nerves after a while and yet there's no indication of that in your books.
Well, you know, what we did, for one thing, is we planned our route very carefully, so we were never in the bad weather areas during that season. So that's, if you look at our world map at the front of the book, we did a very zigzag route of north and south of the equator to avoid the cyclone, the hurricane season, or the monsoons. So, you know, if you're there in the nice weather, then you can be up on deck. And, of course, we weren't a lot of time at sea. We did have a couple of very long trips, which were crossing the Atlantic, which was 17 days, and from Galapagos to the Marquesas in the South Pacific, which was 19 days. But generally it was much shorter trips, often just day sailing. So then, of course, you know, you're out for a few hours on the water, but you get to a new place, you go ashore, or you go swimming, you're up on deck. So you very seldom are you all below, unless, of course, you're sleeping below. And when we were on the ocean, we always kept 24-hour watches. One person would be on watch all the time. But, no, it didn't seem small. In fact, it was funny when we came back, because we left our boat in Florida for a bit and came back to the house, and the kids would be asking me for things, and I'd say, oh, darn, got them on the boat, you know. Haven't got them in the house yet.
Do I remember right, in your first book, Just Cruising, the first part of the trip, did you have one of the sons, was he born on that trip, the first part, or apparently I'm remembering wrong?
Yes, actually, no. Our youngest was 2 when we set out. Now, all of our children have been on the boat from a very young age. I mean, all of them have been on, I think, cruising from just a few days old. And we were fortunate that way, that for them it had always been a very positive experience. We'd go off here, we're in Vancouver, and because of Vancouver Island, where we sail here is sort of like a big lake. Lovely for kids, and we went off with other families. So when we had said to them, the older 2 who were 6 and 8 when we made the decision to go, when we said, well, what do you think? I mean, for them, and of course we'd only planned originally for 2 years. For them, they just said, oh, a 2-year summer holiday, this is fantastic. And then, of course, we had to do school on board, but we did that in the mornings, and it really worked very well into the routine.
Now, you have, how old are your sons? Now, Cole and Duncan and Jamie. Duncan left you for a while and went back home to Vancouver to go to a more formal school. But the other kids studied on board the ship on board the boat as you were going around?
Yes, in fact, they all did for the first 3 years. And then we got to Australia, and you may recall that we had been invited to be participants in the tall ships events in the Australian bicentenary. Yeah. And with that came a working visa. So we worked in Australia, and the boys went to regular school for a year. And we wanted to see how they would do, both socially as well as academically. And when they were just fine, we decided, well, we needn't come back across the Pacific and come home, return to Vancouver immediately. We could kind of go the long way round and complete our circumnavigation. But what we found was that Duncan then went on to the high school correspondence program, which was far more arduous, took a lot more time. And he'd been in a very active class in school, very stimulating class, and particularly got very involved in team sports, particularly in the community. And as we went up quite a long Australian coast and the weather wasn't terrific, I realized how tough it was for him to be working by himself 5 hours a day. So I wrote back to Vancouver to a private school saying, somewhere down the line, maybe we would think of him going back and boarding. And when we got round to Darwin, they had a letter there saying, look, we'd like to have him now if he wants to come. So we said to Duncan, well, you've got this opportunity. And, of course, we didn't want him to leave, but when you extend from a 2-year trip to a 6-year trip, you do have to look at all the aspects for every family member. And finally, after we'd gone through what he would miss if he left and various aspects of it, he said, well, I don't want to leave the cruising life, but, if I don't start school again until we return when he would be 16, he would have never got into team sports again. And team sports were really important to him, and now he's at university. He's been on a rugby scholarship. He's just been asked to play for Canada. So it was good from that point of view that he came back, and then he joined us in some holidays.
Now, just to talk about you and your husband for a bit. You're both from England, and you both eventually ended up in Canada, and you now live in Vancouver and have lived in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, for some time. So you went around the world in a sense, as a couple of Canadians. Mm-hmm. But you grew up in England. What was your background so far as the sea is concerned? Your background and a whole lot of other things is quite extensive. Psychology primarily, special education, and all of that. Vocational rehabilitation. You're a very impressive lady.
Oh, well, I just sort of like to be stimulated. But I grew up, I was very fortunate. My father was always interested in boating and sailing. And my family home was just outside London on the Thames, on the River Thames. And that's where I first began sailing, sort of tacking up and down the river. But we also spent our summers on the south coast and had a cottage on the Solent. And that's where I really learned to sail. And funnily enough, although I had met my husband in the Caribbean, he grew up across the way from where my summer cottage was on the Isle of Wight, sailing in very similar boats to me. And we also knew a lot of people in common. So I was fortunate that way in my boating background. And I think when you learn to sail in England, the weather can be pretty inclement at times. You learn what it's like to go out in the rain and the cold and the wind. And so that really equipped me quite well for going offshore. And subsequently at university, I raced for the university team. I was at Trinity Dublin and also did quite a lot of ocean racing. So I was used to being on the ocean.
Now, this book begins in Australia. As you mentioned, you've been called to take part in Australia's tall ships celebration, and you were there for a year. And the book picks up at that point from Australia throughout back to Florida and back to Canada and all of that through Africa, and I'm going backwards now. But while reading your book, I kept looking at the maps, and I kept looking at more extensive maps I had at home, and I kind of feel like it was a great education in world geography, in addition to the fact that wondering how a family can stick together through all of this on a 6-year trip. But you spent a lot of time of it on land, visiting some really exotic places. Like where? What did you find was particularly interesting? And were there places you had never been before?
Oh, I think the Indian Ocean is just really exotic. In fact, most boats go across the Indian Ocean in about 5 months. And as soon as we got to Indonesia, and certainly it had been in the back of our minds before, we said, hey, we can't just rush this. We need a lot of time. And so we spent 18 months crossing the Indian Ocean, and we didn't go up the Red Sea as did most of our friends because we had been in the Mediterranean. We decided we'd go around South Africa and the Cape of Good Hope. And yes, I mean, it's phenomenal. We went to one island in Indonesia, Wangi, where we were the first people, overseas visitors, since the Japanese had left at the end of the war. And certainly into very different cultures. We went to see the Komodo dragons. We went to Borneo. And then going further afield, Thailand was magnificent. And as you mentioned, travel was very much the focus of our trip. And where we could, we would leave the boat, maybe leaving friends looking after it or find someone to look after it, and then go inland. We might just take a local bus. It might be further afield. We went up from Phuket, where we were on the boat in Thailand, up to Bangkok, and then right up to the Burmese border at Mae Hon Son. And so that's what I really get into in my book as well, the fascinating travel you can do. And you can do it quite inexpensively. We used a lot of the backpackers' books, the Lonely Planet guides, that really were excellent. And of course, on a boat, you go to places like Chagos in the Indian Ocean, which is south of the Maldives, where we also went. But Chagos, there's no population, and you really can't get there at all unless you go by boat. So you go to these very remote places and have very different experiences to the average tourist.
You've got some great pictures in here, too. Were those taken by you?
Most of them, yes. I mean, Andy or myself. One or two. My nephew came to stay, which is why we have the nice pictures of the family on the cover of the book, and one or two inside. We made a point of that because, you know, what happens is when you're taking the photos, you never get yourselves together.
That's right.
In fact, the other day I had to find a photo. We have an article coming in Sail magazine very soon, and they wanted a photo of Andy and I together on the boat, and I had quite a struggle with that one.
It's kind of funny. We had a comedy team out of Boston that worked nationally called Bob and Ray, who were very funny people, and one of their routines was about the Komodo dragon, and I thought they were making it up. It was a funny bit, and you've got a whole section here on the Komodo dragon, which is real. Would you tell us about that? I've looked at pictures of that, and it's a kind of ugly-looking animal. I guess it dates back thousands and thousands and thousands of years, like it has never evolved. And but they're still very much in existence in Indonesia.
They're just mainly in this one island, Komodo, and a couple of islands just around there. And they were pretty much left alone because with the string of islands of southern Indonesia, the current that whips through them is pretty strong, and it was always quite uncomfortable on a boat. They're amazing. They're monitor lizards. When they've had a good meal, they get up to about 200 kilos. We arrived, and we've been told that there was a ravine.
I'm sorry. You do a lot. You do the book in meters and stuff, and I had to keep translating. But you said the
kilos.
The Komodo dragons was in pounds. How much would that be?
200 kilos, 440 pounds.
Okay.
So pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
So we went, having been told that they fed these dragons in one of the ravines on a Sunday. We arrived on a Saturday to make sure, everything was okay and where should we go. And the guide said, do you want to come and look at them today? So we walked up quite a long, dusty path, and there they were in this ravine, very sleepy. It was the in the heat of the day. And the guide said, "Oh, do you want to go a little closer?" So, of course, my son said, "Oh, yes." And we went down, and the guide had a long pronged fork. And if the dragons got a little friendly, he put the prong on the back of their neck and kind of guided them away. Well, it was very interesting, a bit scary, but very interesting getting so close to them. And yes, they do. I mean, in every way, they date back to skeletons that have been found, at the end of the age of the dinosaurs. Anyway, so we had our good look at them when they were docile, went up the following morning and arrived just as a goat was being slaughtered and screaming away. And the dragons just go crazy at the smell of blood. And they were totally different animals. They just leapt up to try to get these bits of goat, and the claws would kind of scrape on the other scales and squeal away, and it was amazing with their weight how quickly they could move. And there was no biting or chewing when they got a bit of goat. It just sort of glided down and disappeared, and they were on to the next bit. Meanwhile, we were put in what they called a theater. It was basically a cage at the top of the ravine to watch all this. And anyway, we watched the spectacle, and we always laugh now because it was so awesome. We didn't take any photos of it at all. And it was all over, and the dragons started wandering off. They live in burrows. And they were wandering off down the road. And some of the tourists wandered off too. And suddenly a girl was squealing. And she realized that she and her boyfriend were walking down the path. A dragon was walking between them.
Oh, jeez.
And of course, the guide should never have let them out. They were fine, but it was a dramatic ending to a dramatic morning.
But apparently there's one guide, or the guides have, some kind of a stick or something that can control the dragon. I still wouldn't trust that guide with his stick or something. When you look at, a 400-pound animal like that, because you've had this over these 6 years, it's hard to know where to pin it down. But did you come across many? It seemed as though there was kind of a group of people doing, if not a similar trip, cruising along parts of where you were going. You seemed to bump into people that you knew quite often. Is this kind of an inner circle of people who know each other? That is one of the most stupid questions I think I've ever asked.
But sort of right. What happens is, and I have to tell you, the camaraderie between cruisers is probably, when people are talking about their trip, that's always number one. I mean, it's just amazing, the close connection, the close relationships you form with these people. And I think last Christmas we had, a good 60, if not 70 letters from people that we'd met cruising around the world. What you find is that there are groups of people in certain places. So we met a group who were in the Mediterranean and then crossed the Atlantic together. Then when we decided not to come back up to the States, but to continue into the Pacific, we were just with one or two boats. And then when we got to French Polynesia, we had met another group of people who'd come from the west coast of the States and Canada, maybe down to Mexico, and then come down south. So we crossed the South Pacific with them. Far fewer boats going on, in fact, very few going on into the Indian Ocean. And because we did it so slowly, I think there were maybe 5 others who were sort of doing the same trip as us, and we actually very seldom saw them, but we talked most days on the radio. And the radio is a wonderful link with the real world in every way. You talk to your fellow cruisers, you listen to the BBC or Voice of America or Radio Australia, whatever you can get into. So yes, there are a lot of people out there. What we found as we went down was that people would maybe leave their boats. Friends of ours left their boat in New Zealand, went back to Bermuda, worked, and then set out again. And we all met up in Australia. And then again in South Africa, and we hadn't seen them at that point for maybe 3 years. So it's actually quite a small world when you get out there, and a friendship that will last forever. And in fact, I have to tell you, last Monday was my 50th birthday, and I met a girl who was 50 the next day, and her husband had sailed originally as a young lad with 2 other guys from Australia, and we had met both of those other men with their families in our travels. Anyway, I'd heard that they'd recently moved, this couple, and I thought, oh, I have no idea how to get hold of Susie. Well, she phoned me on her birthday from Abu Dhabi. So that was a really nice link with her again. I hadn't seen her since 1990 in Singapore. So that's the kind of camaraderie that you get out there.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. I wondered, too, the experience that your boys have get. Does that make it difficult when they're dealing with kids who haven't traveled more than 50 miles away? I mean, these are kids who've had experience that has opened up a whole world to them in many ways. How does this affect their lives?
Oh, it affects them hugely. Quite interestingly, when we came back, two were teenagers and Jamie was 8. And teenagers are not interested in other teenagers who've done different things. They're only interested if you're really good at hockey or you're really good at football or something like that. So my kids just sort of ignored it had kind of happened at that point unless someone directly asked them. Duncan now at university, his university friends come back and they just can't ask me enough questions. Of course, we have a lot of souvenirs around the house, whether it's in pictures or carvings or shells or whatever, and they just can't ask me enough. Now, Duncan, who's 19, has definitely got the wanderlust in his blood. I mean, he really wants to travel, and he's hopefully going to go into forestry now, which is a good job to have if you want to go to particularly third world countries, different countries. Jamie at 8, his friends were interested in a sort of a wow kind of a way. I had his class on board the boat one day, and I showed them slides before, and they came down to the boat, and their first impression was, oh, it's awfully small. And they rushed below and said, oh, too small, went up on deck. And he was giving them rides in the bosun's chair. He was sort of hauling them halfway up the mast and swinging them around. And when he'd given them the ride, they all came back down again. And I had our GPS on, our navigation helper, and I had a chart out, and I showed them how to plot the latitude and longitude, and they were fascinated by that. And then they started just sort of climbing to the end of a bunk, and we've got lots of books on board, and they take out a book. And suddenly one of them said, hey, do you know, there are 18 of us down here. This isn't crowded at all. This is really neat.
Sounds like the way kids talk. Hey, this is cool, man. But you hit just so many places. Could you just pick out? This is kind of the lazy way out for an interviewer. But the book is so fascinating that I wondered if you could pick out some of the highlights or some of the places that you found particularly intriguing, because you hit so many places that most of the people who are listening today would probably never get to any of them. We're talking places like in Indonesia. We're talking the Maldives, Seychelles, and places most people are not even aware where they are. Could you just pick out a few highlights and tell us about that?
Absolutely. When we set out, we of course set out from England and went down the Atlantic European coast and into the Mediterranean. And we had a year there. And I think our highlight really of the Mediterranean, although we enjoyed all of it immensely, was Turkey. We had no idea what to expect, and we were just enchanted in every way. The people were delightful. It's obviously a very different culture, a Muslim culture. They had Turkish carpets all over the cars to keep them cool. The food was delicious. The ancient sites were not crowded and magnificent. And that was for us a real highlight of maybe that year and a half. And it was interesting. It was in Turkey that we met an Australian lady who invited us to the Tall Ships event. So it was sort of significant in that way. It was the place where really it was instigated our continuing for the 6 years. Another island we loved, going out through the Mediterranean on our way to the Canaries across the Atlantic, was Madeira. Not a great place to cruise. We actually had a little accident there. Someone lifted our anchor, and we ended up having a rudder that had to be repaired in a major way. And so we were there longer than expected. And what a delightful island. So beautiful. We went walking on the levadas, which are the old irrigation channels on the sides of the mountains, and loved the food there again and the people. we're used to the Caribbean. I think the Caribbean is spectacular, but we had lived down there for a few years, so it's fun for us just going home. Then crossing the Pacific, well, Galapagos. I mean, if anyone who's listening has the opportunity to go to the Galapagos Islands, just take it. The animals are so tame. And it's interesting the impact on you, and particularly the boys, of actually having been there. After we were back, we saw a magnificent nature film on the Galapagos, and I thought, oh, if only we'd been there or noticed that or known that. And yet, listening to this film, the boys came up with so many comments of just observations and well, why didn't they show that? That was really neat. And do you remember this? And so actually being in a place has just such a huge impact. Australia is just a wonderfully exotic country. We could have easily gone on living there. In fact, we could have done on my job, but somehow as our worlds and family are Vancouver and England, it seemed a long, long way away to suddenly resettle. The Indian Ocean, yes, very remote. Indonesia, there's so many countries to go to. It stretches for 2,500 miles. We went to
Indonesia. Indonesia has. Did you write 14,000 islands made up Indonesia?
Oh yes, unbelievable numbers, and really very few are populated. The ones that are quite densely populated. We found Bali is magnificent with the very artistic Hindu people, and just beautiful to go to, quite touristy in some areas, but actually even those were fun. But then going up in the hills, the peace, the calm, the magic of the music. I mean, just wonderful, wonderful place to visit. Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, very, very interesting indeed. And then we went on to the Andaman Islands that belong to India, and we were the third yacht that had ever been there. Incidentally, the second with permission, and I had spent many hours and days in the Indian consulate in Singapore getting permission. And I think it was finally when I went in with the kids and their school books that they thought, oh, this lady means business, we'd better give it to her.
That's right, because you ran into a lot of officials who really gave you a very bad time. The bureaucracy would show its face every now and then. Some countries tougher than others, no?
Yeah, it's not such a bad time as an irritating time. You know, officials everywhere, I guess they're the same. They just, this is their power, and you have to be very patient. And usually my husband went along and visited the officials while I was teaching school, and he's not someone who likes to wait, but it was just part of the life. He went along with his latest yachting magazine or novel or something like that.
So he could sit down and read while he was
just
waiting.
Waited them out. And, you know, when they see that, then there's no point. And we never bribed anyone. I mean, you know, not only wouldn't we do that for ourselves, it wasn't on our budget, but you have to think of the people who are behind you cruising. You know, if you give something, they want more from the person behind you. So it's just patience, but we were very careful always to have our documents in order. And that took quite a lot of planning. And actually one of the things that happened, which was quite amusing, I thought, but the officials didn't think it was amusing, was that I'd gone to endless trouble to get Jamie a visa for Brazil while we were in South Africa. Now, the rest of us also had British passports, and on a British passport, you don't need a visa in Brazil, but you do on a Canadian one. So I had to send Jamie off, passport off, to get new pages put in, and had to get them, them to send it on to the Brazilian consulate, and we finally got it back in a different place. We left, the wind was very light, and when we finally arrived in Brazil, unknown to us, we didn't even think to look, his 3-month visa had expired by 2 days. Mm. Well, let me tell you, the officials were not impressed, and I said, but the wind was too light. Well, they finally decided, when we obviously weren't going to cough up with anything that, that as an 8-year-old, he wasn't an undesirable alien, and they'd better let him in. But they kept us hanging around for a while.
The repairs on the ship now sounded like Humphrey Bogart in The African Queen, because your husband did most of the repairs, did he not? And you must have got to some places where something went wrong, and it must have been hard to find a replacement.
That's right. I mean, you carry as many replacements as you can. And of course, it's always sod's law that the thing that breaks is not what you've got a replacement for. You know? Yes, and Andy is just wonderful at fixing anything in any place. But as you go further afield, you definitely have to be far more self-sufficient in every way. And sometimes you have to wait for parts to be flown in. It's funny, in traveling, the places that are really cheaper to travel in are the places where it's far more difficult to maintain your boat. So you have to be prepared for that, and you have to be flexible. The whole thing about the lifestyle is to be flexible. Flexible that your itinerary might have to change. Flexible that you may not be able to buy what you intended to buy ashore in terms of food, and certainly not the brand names you're used to. But to us, all that was part of the adventure. We would wander ashore in a new place, and incidentally, as we were sightseeing, say, oh, you know, there's the baker, we might as well get some bread, and, oh, let's go to the market, and what fruit and vegetables do they have here? And that is, whether you're just a traveler on land in a regular sense or on a boat, that is just so important for your enjoyment.
When you were going across the Indian Ocean, for example, which you said took, how many days was that?
It took, well, we just sort of short hopped across the Indian Ocean. We were at it for about a year and a half.
But the Indian Ocean itself, I mean, that trek when you were on the ocean, on the water for what are the longer periods? You took shorter treks where you got on land quite a good deal. But was that, now, when you crossed the Indian Ocean, were you there a couple of weeks or something on the water, or am I remembering wrong?
No, actually, we were more in the Pacific. The Pacific is by far the biggest ocean. The Indian Ocean, we left Thailand, and it was probably, maybe 3 days to the Andaman Islands, maybe 4 or 5 days to Sri Lanka, 3 days up to India, 4 days down to the Maldives, another 4 down to Chagos, a week across to the Seychelles, and another week across to Africa.
Okay, now those, but the Pacific was obviously took a lot longer. And I guess what I'm leading up to is, what about the kids? What do they do, young boys, to amuse themselves during that period of time? A certain amount of it is education, isn't it? Because they're doing their schooling. But I just can't imagine kids sitting still for that length of time.
Well, they just get into the routine. Now, when we did our first long trip, which was crossing the Atlantic, I had a new book or a new game to introduce to them every day. But as time went on, they were so used to being at sea. We always talked to other cruisers, so there would be a radio scare at 8 in the morning, and everyone listened to that avidly. And that would maybe go on for half an hour or 3/4 of an hour. We were fishing all the time, so every so often we caught a fish, and that was a major activity. They had a lot of books, a lot of tapes. They did their schoolwork. We played games. I don't know how many card games I played, particularly Uno. I must have played that for hours and hours and hours on deck. And the other thing that I did a lot was I would read out loud a lot to the entire family. When the kids were younger, we just loved Roald Dahl. I mean, he's just great to read and so descriptive. So there were a lot of family activities. They also collected shells. We were very conservationist about it, but we have a fine shell collection. They would look up in the shell books to do a lot of research, or it may be land animals, or it may be the flowers, the trees. So I had a lot of books on board for the specific area, so that that was an added stimulation. There was never a dull moment. The boys never once at any time while we were on the boat said, I'm bored.
Are they going with you on this next trip?
Oh, Jamie will. Jamie is 13, and he is going off this summer to the Optimist World Championships. He's turned out the Optimist of the small, probably the smallest, certainly the most popular boats worldwide that the kids sail, and they're in South Africa this year, so that's kind of exciting for him to go back to Cape Town. And he will go on this next trip, and I'm sure the other two will come and join us.
I wish you the very best. The book is fascinating. Still Cruising. Does this have pretty good distribution in most bookstores? Do you know?
Yes, it may be in your bookstore, may not. It's certainly in West Marine, the nautical bookstore in Boston. And I'd also like to give you an 800 number for the Armchair Sailor in Newport, Rhode Island.
Right, fine.
Because they definitely have the books in, and that's 800-29-CHART. So that's C-H-A-R-T.
Okay, 1-800-29-CHART. And the book is called Still Cruising, written by Liza Copeland. You do all the writing then. And Andy does not write at all or give lectures?
Yes, Andy does a lot of writing, but I just happen to have written the books, and he's one of my major editors, and I really appreciate his input.
Okay, you're still friends even after being in close quarters together all that time. I think that's a marriage that can never fail. I
think it's easier, I think it's more difficult being home.
Is that right? This way you have a common project that you're working on together. I'm just thinking, what a lovely adventure later on. I mean, you have so much to talk about, so many things that you have done together. That is just perfect. I was thinking what a lovely marriage you must have to have survived all this, and it probably has grown stronger. I may be getting too terribly emotional about this, but I think that is really nice. Plus the fact that I've learned an awful lot from the book, so much so that it was kind of hard for me to ask specific questions. There's such a wide area you covered about. You give descriptions of different cities you've been in. Like I feel like I've been to Singapore as a result of just reading your description of it, and all these other places you've been to. It's just lovely, and I really thank you very much for coming on and talking about it, Liza.
Oh, well, Norm, it's lovely to be with you.
And good luck on your next trip, and I hope we'll talk again soon.
Thanks very much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Liza Copeland, Still Cruising. It's very hard for me to imagine a family being when I say they were at sea for 6 years, it wasn't, they were on a trip for 6 years, but they did hit land and spend days in some of the most exotic places in the world. What an absolutely incredible experience. You almost just can't imagine it. Thank you very much. Later on, we're going to be talking with a woman named J. Ben Lasser, who has written a book called A Foxy Old Woman's Guide to Traveling Alone Around Town and Around the World. So if you're a woman ready to take a trip and you're wondering, should I go? Should I go by myself? That Tony Nesbitt has left for me. He does the lining up of people for the program. He says she has traveled around the world 13 times and will regale us with fascinating stories of her many encounters and adventures, and she will also provide invaluable travel advice on everything from meeting single men at zoos in Zanzibar to how to pack all your stuff into one travel bag. Hey, that's you. That's a big assignment, J. Ben Lesser. I'm delighted that to be able to talk with you.
Yes, I think you sort of carried away there.
You think I was kind of floating off in some kind of a cloud? I was going to quote some of your stuff, David, but we'll take some calls. I think that'd be good.
Okay, great.
People can ask you. Did you come up with an answer?
No, I'm afraid not. I looked at some of my sources. Can't find it. I think what happened is I found the answer in a book, so I didn't write about it because I found it in the book.
Okay. And you figured, heck, it's already been answered. I want the tough ones. Okay, let's go to Dave in Newton. Hi, Dave. You're on WBZ.
Hi, how you doing?
Good, thanks.
I have a question. The Americans who came, the people who came on the Mayflower and came to Virginia and Jamestown came around the same time in the beginning of the 1600s, and yet the people of the South today in New England have very different accents, and neither of them are like British accents today. And I'm wondering how that changed so drastically if they came from the same place at the same time.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm going to duck it as best I can, Dave, because it's very, very, very complicated. What seems to happen is just as if you start interbreeding within one family, you get sort of weird kinds of diseases. When you get people who are insulated from outside culture together, even if they have the same backgrounds, they start talking in different ways than their other people who are far away. I mean, in many countries, it's much more extreme than it is here. For example, in Italy, you can travel 15 or 20 miles and find people who literally have different words for the same object and can't understand what what you're saying in the dialects of people around you. Now, it's funny because I'm trying to research something very similar, which is why Southerners speak slower than people in the North. And I can't get a decent answer to this. But there are whole books on the formations of accents. It's really very, very complicated, and it has a lot to do with how heterogeneous a population there is. For example, I've been sort of shocked. I've been down to Dallas a lot recently, and noticed that they don't seem to have what I would call a Texas accent, and a lot of that is because Dallas is really a relatively new city. Most of the people are coming from other places, and as a result, the accents are sort of flattened out there. Now, I think what's going to happen over the next 100 years as the mass media has more and more of an impact, and people are watching national television, is that the Southern accent's going to flatten out and become more and more generically American. But I don't know.
Huh.
I think in other words, Dave, if you go to say Appalachia, where people are very poor, in some cases too poor to even have a television set, you'll find the accents much, much thicker than, say, if you go to Atlanta, which is sort of a cosmopolitan city.
Uh-huh.
So why it developed the way it did in the South, I have no idea.
Yeah, even here in New England, we have different. People talk about a New England accent, and there really isn't any. There are a whole lot of different accents in New England.
Do you think the degree of the so-called Boston accent, the so-called New England accent, has decreased over the years?
Oh, I'm sure. As you pointed out, I think television and even radio before that to a lesser extent, and movies also. It kind of people get to hear other ways of speaking, and I think I think in a way it's diminished a whole lot of things, not only accents, but we have fast food places that look the same. The cities look the same across country. There aren't different kinds of looks to different communities like there used to be way back. But in New England, for example, around Boston, here's a Boston accent. Are you excited about me doing this little run-through for you guys? Or would you rather I just shut up? Okay, a Boston accent would be, hi, I come from Dorchester, around Upham's Corner. I was going to thinking of going to Harvard, but anyway, that's the Boston area. Then there's the country New England accent, which I think is much, much nicer. It's like, this is Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. There are differences in all three states, but roughly they sound like, I'm going out to milk the cows right now, you see, and then after that, we'll have supper, and later on, That kind, but Western Massachusetts sounds like Connecticut, which sounds like the Midwest, and Rhode Island. Parts of it sound almost like Brooklyn. So there are a whole lot of different kinds of accents. I guess it depends, as David said, depends on where people settled and all that kind of stuff when they came here.
Another place that's just a thick stew of accents is New Orleans area. You go just a little bit west of the city, and you get the Cajun and the French influence. And it's like they're speaking a different language.
Yeah, I think the Boston accent, some of Massachusetts, Eastern Massachusetts accent, the Kennedys, for example, who people are aware of most of all, it's from the British who settled in this area. That kind of
stuff. Absolutely. And when you look at old movies, you see American movies from the 30s and the 40s. You see a sort of a finishing school accent that has traces of England in it that I'm not sure anybody really spoke like that normally.
I know it.
Katharine Hepburn was one example of that.
That's right, and she was from New England.
Yes.
Betty Davis also.
Yes.
Hey, Dave, thank you very much for calling.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to, Andrea in the town of Canton, Massachusetts. You're on the air with David Feldman. Andrea?
Good evening.
Hi.
Good evening.
My question concerns those little teeny ears of corn that you get at Chinese restaurants in some of their dishes.
Right.
I'd like to know how they grow. If they look like little baby corn plants, if they just pick them when they're small, or if it's a whole different setup.
No, they're called baby corn, and there is a scientific name for them. They do grow like other kinds of corn. They do have ears. They do have cobs. It's funny because I did a little research on this question because a reader wrote to me and asked why you can't buy them in the supermarket. Actually, in a few gourmet supermarkets, you can. You actually can buy them fresh, but they were what's the word for that? Bred. They were genetically bred specifically for this purpose. They aren't some kind of strange mutation. Somebody came up with the idea of breeding these little baby corns.
But are the plants like 4 or 5 feet tall with big leaves?
Oh, no. Okay. Everything is smaller.
Okay, so everything is miniaturized.
But it is actually corn. It is just a different, a breed of corn.
And it's got silk and everything
Yes.
on it. Wow.
That's
so
used to pollinate the corn.
I feel bad for the poor people who have to take and chuck them.
Well, that's another whole genre, Andrea, of questions I get asked. I mean, how do they peel cocktail onions? How do they? What about? How would you like to be the person who had to get rid of the shells of macadamia nuts?
I would not want to be that. Those are the hardest nuts on earth.
Yeah. So, in Hawaii, the way they do it when it grows in the wild is they drive their cars over them.
No kidding.
Yeah. Just using a hammer is not enough often to get those things open.
Well, thank you. I would have a million questions, but I know other people have their own. So thank you very much.
Yeah, nice to call, Andrea.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye. We really have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Jean is in Medford. Hi, Jean. You're on WBZ, and you're talking with David Feldman.
Hi, David.
Hi, Gene.
On a television program that's on Saturday night, which is Bible quizzes and so forth, they keep speaking of the common era. I can't find what that is.
Now that's kind of interesting. Yeah, I know you know the answer to that, David, and even I know that, too.
Well, go ahead.
The common era, because that replaces before Christ in the Judaism.
Right.
In Judaism, they don't talk in terms of Christ as being the Son of God and all of that, and as you do in Christianity. And so they substitute the term the years prior to the birth of Christ, rather than say BC, before Christ, with the common era. That's a kind of a Jewish way of ignoring the fact that many other people in Christianity believe in Christ as being the Son of God.
And Gene, if you want to get more information about it, like if you look it up in a dictionary, you probably won't see it under Common Era because it's most often referred to as BCE, before the Common Era.
I had a Bible commentary and a Bible dictionary, large volumes of them, and I didn't find it in either one. Perhaps I'm looking in the wrong place.
You might try under BCE or before the Common Era.
Oh, okay.
That might help you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gene. That's interesting. I forgot about that. It is BC, and in Judaism, you add the E to it.
I've never seen it referred to as after the Common Era, though. It's always before.
That's right. They're like in the year of our Lord.
I guess we're in the Uncommon Era now.
Okay. Anyway, you want to give an address if people have questions or want to write to you? Because
Sure.
the books are fascinating, and it's David Feldman. You have had different publishers at various times, including Harper. The current book, Why Are Hyenas Laughing? What Are Hyenas Laughing At Anyway? Published by Putnam. And anyway, what would the address be for people?
If you want to write to me by mail, it's Post Office Box 24815, Los Angeles, California, and the zip is 90024. And if you want a response, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope. And if you want to reach me in cyberspace, just write to Feldman at imponderables.com, and it'll get to me.
That's excellent. You're fascinating. We just have to do this again because an awful lot of people wanted to talk with you, and you're really a great deal of fun to talk
I'd be
with.
delighted any time, Norm.
Hey, thank you very much, David, and here's hoping you have an early and warm and sunny and healthy spring.
Thanks. You too.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. David Feldman, who's written about eight books with all these kind of questions in them, which I find fascinating. For example, let's see. For example, what? Why do newspapers yellow so much faster than other kinds of paper? Why do gorillas pound their chests? Well, we never got to the question about Baby Ruth. Baby Ruth, the candy bar, was not named after Babe Ruth. I don't know if I got time before the news to tell you what was it. It was named after. It honors President and Mrs. Grover Cleveland's daughter. They referred to as Baby Ruth, and there's a whole lot more besides. But the books are like that. They're just absolutely fascinating. Lived in Lynn.
Can I
Yes.
ask you what the years were?
Yes.
Basically.
The years were 1950 to about 1956. I think we moved from there to Middleton around 56 or 57.
The reason
And we
I'm
were
asking,
Middleton all those years after that.
the reason I'm asking you that is because I'm Greek and I hear a lot of stories about Harry Hyenas.
Oh, sure.
Do you remember the ball player?
Legend.
Do you remember the funeral at all?
No, I don't. I remember he was very much revered by everybody.
Yeah.
And he was of course from Lynn.
Because my last name is Hyenas and I am a relative of Harry, but
Oh, really?
I've always wanted to speak to somebody that basically grew up near the St. George Church.
Well, I lived on Baker Street at that point, which is on the other side of the Common. St. George Church,
That's
as
the
I remember,
church,
is
yeah.
on the South Common,
Yeah.
and on the other side is North Common, and we lived on Baker Street, which was off of there. It's within walking distance. It's within less than a mile of
Yeah.
St. George Church.
Because I heard the funeral was totally incredible. It was one of the biggest ones around.
I wouldn't be surprised. He was, everybody loved him, and everybody was so saddened by the fact that he was an incredible athlete who died so young.
That's
so
true.
young, it was heartbreaking. And so I would imagine the funeral, everything about him is still legend.
Yeah, that's true. We basically, our church and different organizations raised money, and we built a statue for him.
Yes.
It's in the sports museum.
Oh, I didn't know. Oh, that's right. I've heard about that. I haven't.
At the mall there.
Yeah, I've never been to the sports museum.
Yeah.
That was really nice. Now, you were a cousin? Is that what you're saying?
My father came from the same village as their parents, and they were first cousins.
Okay,
so
that.
my father basically first cousins, and Harry Gans was my second cousin.
Okay, I've never been able to figure out what the difference is between second cousins and a cousin twice removed, and it gets kind of complicated.
That's true.
But anyway, you're a close relative.
Yeah.
And you ought to be very proud of that. He'd be apparently something very special. I suspect he'd be proud of you, too.
I don't know about that.
What do you do?
We're plowing snow right now. We do malls and stuff.
Oh, do you?
Our company, yeah.
Well, you do good work for people.
Nah, we try hard, basically.
No, you dig them out of bad situations. You're very valuable.
Very difficult these days.
I know it.
I'm sure you know. Well, it's been, a pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure talking to you, Steve. Thanks. Unless you heat the coop, they will not lay. And so once they start laying under those natural conditions, it means the days are longer and warmer, and it is a tremendous sign of spring.
And this snowstorm is a beautiful spring snowstorm.
Now, do you have hens?
Yes,
Obviously you do, because otherwise you wouldn't know what you just said.
I have a dozen of them.
Oh, what kind of hens do you have? Rhode Islands?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Rhode Island Reds. And listen, this is personal.
Yeah.
What happened to Lavelle tonight when he ended up in the ditch? Who got him out?
I don't know. No, I talked to Lavelle when I came in, but there's only about a 5-minute break while the news is on between the time he leaves and the time I come on. So I can't talk with him about anything in great detail because I had a guest on. But I heard the same thing you did, the fact that he spun out and ended up in the ditch. Maybe he was able to drive himself out, or maybe he got pulled out. I'm going to have to ask him. I'm not sure.
You got in all right? Obviously.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Well, good night, Lavelle.
Okay.
Good night, Norm.
Okay, good night to you, Greta. Okay. 254-1030, area code 617. No, I was driving kind of carefully, because I'd heard of the roads could have been kind of slippery, but they were not bad. I left the last of March.
Oh, good.
March through the first. I don't have the schedule right in front of me.
You know, you always say that to me.
No, I know, because I keep the schedule at home, and I don't bring it in with me. Yeah. But it's the last few days in March and the first week in April. Something that isn't too far off. That's another month.
You ought to enough. I mean, I don't mean to say anything. You ought to have the complete weekend. I mean, I just think...
Well, I'm on pretty much the complete weekend.
No, you take off at 1 o'clock on Sunday.
Well, I won't this Sunday night. This Sunday night will be on right
now,
through.
I have to go to Connecticut to a shower in the morning.
Yeah?
Give you my life story. And, no, I'm just kidding around with you because I love you so much.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
I really do.
Thank you.
And, I don't mean to complain, but, we can't get you in Connecticut. And I have tons of relatives there, and they have tons of relatives. And they have heard me talking about you so much, and I'll be damned, we can't get you.
It's kind of odd, the coverage, because there are many parts of Connecticut that we don't come into too well. That's right. And even parts of the Cape Cod and southeastern Massachusetts, and around Springfield, we don't do too well. And yet we come in Ohio and Indiana and Pennsylvania.
They're all calls from all over the place.
I know it.
And here I am in Suffield, Connecticut, and, my sister and the brother-in-law and the kids, they say, we want to hear this man, because they hear about you all the time. I talk about you nonstop.
You're lovely.
And they can't, and my sister said, I would love to listen, because she knows I'm, fussy who I like on the radio. I'm very fussy. And I always loved you, and I love Larry Glick.
He's a nice man and a talented guy.
You both can make people laugh.
Well, I was thinking about Larry yesterday. We lost one of our great news people.
I know, Darryl Gould.
Darryl Gould. And I was saying that Darryl was one of those few guys in a business where there's an awful lot of cutthroat kind of activity. I mean, there are good people in the business, too.
Yeah.
But there's some tough ones. And Darryl didn't have a mean bone in his body. He was one of the sweetest guys. He was so sweet. He was unbelievable. And the reason I say that when you mention Larry Glick is Larry Glick is the same way. A sweetheart of a man. A very nice man. He
always could make me laugh. Him and the Glicknick University. And then you with your theme songs. I mean, you two are both hilarious.
Well, thank you.
I used to love it when you said the topic of tonight is nothing.
That's about the topic of every night. I've been talking about nothing for the past 50 years.
I love when you say that. I wanted to tell you something else before I hang up.
Okay.
Last night I really enjoyed, took place in Hartford. It was so moving. It was the skating, and was in memory of the man who died, Sergei. He was the 29-year-old Russian skater.
Yes.
And his wife skated, and Katerina Witt skated, and Scott Hamilton, Brian Boitano, and what was his name? Wiley. I forget it. Paul Wiley. It was in the arena in Hartford. It was so beautiful.
Mm.
And they had Sergei's mother was there from Russia, and his wife's mother was there too, and his little 2-year-old daughter. You would have loved it.
I wish I'd seen it.
It was really, really beautiful.
Mm.
It was like a 2 or 3 hour. It was in memory of him.
Yeah.
And you know what she said? The wife said at the end of the program, she spoke, and she said, and I think of a lot of people when she says this. I mean, you lost your wife, and I lost Ray. And
I'm sorry, Ray was your husband?
My boyfriend for 27 years.
Really? Oh, my.
It was better than the marriage, believe me. But she said, you should always remember to tell people you love them. This is what the...
Absolutely. I said that to somebody the other day.
Yeah.
And I think people look at you like you're some kind of weirdo. I was talking with a friend of mine who was... and I said, boy, hug your wife and treat her well because you don't know how long it's going to last.
And, I have a lot of respect for you. I was listening to you last night, and you are such a really great man and a really decent man. And I liked all those nice things you were saying about Darrell Gould. And I got the paper today, and I was reading, that poor man, he was only 57.
Yes, he was, and
I thought he was 67.
No, he was very young, and he retired very young. But he had about every disease known to man.
I know. He was he died of colon cancer.
Yeah, he died of colon cancer. He also had a kidney replacement, and he had diabetes. And his eyesight was failing, where he could not drive at night.
I know.
And yet he always smiled and was so upbeat. He was married twice. His first wife died of cancer, Joan, and then he remarried this woman, Kathy, both of whom were lovely, lovely people. An unusual man. I mean, this guy is eligible for sainthood, I think.
Oh, you are such you have such class. I mean, you are such a classy man.
Oh, will you stop that,
I mean,
Kathy?
the way you were mentioning him last night, and I was thinking, what a great guy you are.
Well, he was. It's easy to talk nice about guys like Darrell, because he was the great guy.
You have a lot of nice things to say about a lot of people.
Oh, there are a lot of people.
You bring a lot of happiness, and I don't think you realize it. And I don't know if the program director realizes that. When we're home alone at night, I live alone. We like to hear someone like you. I don't want to discuss the world situation. Frankly, I don't care. I want to hear about happy things, and about good things that make you feel good about yourself.
Oh, that's nice, Kathy. I feel the way you do, too. I care about world politics.
But not in the middle of the night.
No, not now. I mean, at times, I especially get tired of talk shows where every talk host figures he's got an answer to every problem of the world, and he's going to pound it down your neck.
And there were many, I'll be honest with you, Norman, there were many lonely nights when you really kept me company.
I thank you very much. You're okay, Kathy.
We have a good night.
You have a good night, too. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Bye-bye, dear. Wife, who at the time was a State House correspondent for a paper called the Lawrence Eagle Tribune, and Darrell was covering the Massachusetts State House for WBC, and I'd heard him on the air and all, but I had never met him before, and she introduced me to him, and she liked him a whole lot. And they both ended up dying of cancer, which is unfortunate. But he was something special, and so I've known him since those days. That would be, I don't know, sometime back in the 60s or 70s, so somewhere in that era.
Well, 57, that is awfully young.
Well, it is, considering that he retired last June because of failing eyesight, and it was a problem for him to get into the studios. He lives in a town about 20, 30 miles northwest of here. Yeah. And so getting to do his job here was kind of tough, so that he and the station worked out a nice arrangement. He was very pleased with retiring, and it's just unfortunate he didn't have a chance to enjoy that retirement for too long.
Yeah. I also enjoyed David Feldman, and it's interesting, he said that he graduated from the popular culture program, which is kind of Ray Brown sort of started off in my discipline. I'm a folklorist also.
Oh, really? Yeah, really. And he was talking about Bowling Green.
That's right.
Did you go to Bowling Green?
No. I graduated from Indiana University's folklore program.
Oh, I see. Okay. Isn't that interesting that they have a folklore program there, too?
Yeah, well, the popular culture program was sort of an offshoot of since Brown started life as a folklorist, and then got into this whole, got the Bowling Green thing off the ground.
And on that note, let me remind you that you can support the show by checking out the links in the description box, Patreon, Castos, and Buy Me a Coffee. Thanks, Fred! Closing the vault and leaving this world a little sillier than we found it for the uppity Vicki León, the Wild Women Association, Minoan Ladies, Canary Press, Bones and Ashes Wine Coolers, King Tut's Crazy Family, Liza Copeland, the Hardy Boat Bagiri, Sailing, Exotic Places, Komodo Dragons and Monitor Lizards, Wanderlust, the Galapagos, the Armchair Sailor, Just Cruisin', Still Cruisin', Foxy Older Women, New England Accents, Baby Corn, BC, AD, CE, and BCE, David Feldman, Putnam Publishing, self-addressed stamped envelopes, imponderables, the New England Sports Museum, the First Egg of Spring, Lavelle in a Ditch, Happy Things, the Lawrence Eagle Tribune, Folklore, Bob Ames, Saint Darrell Gould, and the man with the penchant for foxy, uppity women who sailed the world, Norm Nathan. Let me just say, I love you all. I'm Tony Nesbitt.
This is a really stupid question. I'm saying, am I really, is this really coming out of my mouth? These stupid comments.